Many countries and cities around the world are known for their tourist attractions, which delight visitors from all over. With stunning landscapes, iconic sites, and a multitude of unique experiences, these destinations attract millions of tourists every year. It's easy to think of places like New York, London, Paris, or the paradisiacal beaches scattered along the coastlines of several continents. But what about the least visited place on the planet? Have you ever thought about it? Today, Bello Mundo takes you to Nauru, a tiny piece of land lost in the middle of the Pacific. A place so forgotten that it hardly receives any visitors. But don't let its size fool you. What happens there is worthy of a horror movie. Curious to know how a tropical paradise became one of the most feared and avoided places in the world? Then stick around, because what you'll discover about Nauru will leave your jaw dropping. Number 1. Location and geographical data. Nauru is literally lost in the middle of the Pacific. When we say isolated, it's no exaggeration. The nearest island, Banaba in Kiribati, is more than 300 kilometers away, and reaching the nearest continent is a complicated mission. Brisbane in Australia is almost 3,000 kilometers away, a flight of around 5 hours. Honolulu in Hawaii is more than 4,000 kilometers away, making Nauru one of the most remote places on the planet. Surrounded by coral reefs and with a rugged terrain inland, this small island carries an air of mystery and exclusivity. The difficult access and lack of infrastructure for visitors make it a virtually inaccessible destination. With only one international airport operating on a restricted basis and no natural harbors, getting to Nauru is a real adventure. In addition, its unique location in the middle of the Pacific gives it a rare biodiversity and a virtually untouched environment, both culturally and ecologically. Nauru is a place that few dare to explore, but which holds secrets and stories that impress even the most experienced travelers. Number 2. Third smallest country in the world. But if getting to this country is a real challenge because it's so far away from everything, the perception changes completely when you finally set foot on the island. At just 21 square kilometers, Nauru is the third smallest country in the world, smaller than many big city districts. To give you an idea, everything is within easy reach. The beaches, the administrative center, the houses, it's all right there, close by. In terms of territory, Nauru is second only to the Vatican and Monaco. But here's the big difference. While the Vatican is the spiritual heart of the Catholic Church, and Monaco is synonymous with luxury and glamour on the French Riviera, Nauru is an almost forgotten corner of the Pacific, far from the spotlight and practically unknown to the rest of the world. Number 3. It only has 30 kilometers of roads. And if everything seems a stone's throw away, this is also reflected in the roads. The island has only 30 kilometers of paved roads that encircle the entire country. You can explore Nauru by car in just over an hour without rushing and with the right to stop and admire the blue sea and the surrounding landscapes. With only one gas station and very few cars, traffic jams are non-existent there. In addition to the roads, Nauru has a small railway line of almost 4 kilometers, built in 1907. This track, which was once used to transport phosphate, symbolizes both the prosperity and decadence of the island, since the same phosphate that brought wealth ended up being the reason for its ruin. Number 4. No capital. As well as being small and easy to get around, Nauru is also unique in another respect. It has no official capital. Unlike most countries, this small island follows a very different path. While many countries have a single capital and some even 2 or 3, such as Bolivia and South Africa, in Nauru things are a little simpler, or, depending on your point of view, more complicated. The island has no city that is officially the center of everything. Instead of a city that centralizes everything, the role of capital ends up being assigned to Yaren, a district on the south coast. This is where the parliament, The embassies of countries like Taiwan and Australia and the only international airport are located. But Yaren isn't exactly a city. It's more of an administrative area where everything happens, without the typical structure of a capital city. Number 5, one of the least visited countries in the world. And if the absence of a capital is already quite a peculiarity, here's one more. Nauru is also one of the least visited countries in the world, even with its paradisiacal landscapes and all the island's charm. Only around 200 people venture there each year. But why so few visitors? It's not because of the lack of natural beauty, I can assure you, but because of the difficulties involved in getting there. To begin with, only one airline operates flights to the island, with limited schedules and prices that are less than inviting. And, as if that weren't enough, getting a visa to set foot on Nauruan soil can be a real odyssey. To give you an idea of how exclusive it is to visit this country, less than 15,000 people have ever been to Nauru. It's like being part of a select club of explorers who have unlocked one of the Pacific's best-kept secrets. As well as being a remote destination, Nauru faces a series of challenges that put even the bravest off. And, as we'll see later, there's an even darker reason behind this isolation. Number 6, no army. Another curiosity is that the island has no army. That's right, no soldiers, tanks, or military bases. The island has no armed forces of its own, and if there is any external threat, it is Australia that takes responsibility. This arrangement has been in place for decades and makes sense for such a small and isolated place. Instead of spending its few resources on a military structure, Nauru has chosen to focus on other areas, leaving security in the hands of the Australians. Meanwhile, a small local police force is responsible for maintaining order and solving internal problems. Simple, efficient, and for a country with a population that could fit into a neighborhood in any big city, this strategy proves to be very practical. It's worth remembering that Nauru is not alone in this. Other small countries and islands in the Pacific take a similar approach, relying on larger nations to ensure their safety and security. Simple and effective, isn't it? Number 7, a country of obese people. Continuing our tour of the island, now let's talk about something more serious: health. As well as being one of the least visited countries in the world, Nauru also carries an unenviable title. It is one of the places with the highest obesity rate on the planet. Around 80% of the population is overweight, and the problem goes far beyond genetics or lifestyle. Here, obesity has cultural roots. In the past, being fat was seen as a sign of prosperity. The more you ate, the more successful and healthy you were considered by the community. Leaders and bosses flaunted their bellies like trophies, a symbol of success and happiness. But this distorted view had serious consequences for the health of the Nauruans. With the intense exploitation of phosphate and the loss of fertile land, food became almost exclusively dependent on processed products full of fat and sugar. Without access to healthy options and with an increasingly sedentary lifestyle, the result couldn't be different. Around 40% of the population suffers from diabetes, and for many, this means facing amputations and serious complications that make everyday life even more challenging. But obesity isn't the only problem. Cigarette addiction also seriously affects the health of Nauruans. The country has one of the highest rates of tobacco consumption in the world, which only worsens an already complicated health situation. A real challenge for such a small nation, where public health issues have become huge. Number 8. It was once the richest country in the world. And while we're on the subject of phosphate mining, let's get into the dark side of Nauru. Believe it or not, Nauru, this tiny dot in the middle of the Pacific, was once known as the richest island in the world. That's right, a place that today lives in oblivion was once swimming in money. But how was this possible? It all started in the 1970s, when Nauru achieved absurd wealth thanks to phosphate, a natural resource formed over centuries by seabird droppings. This white gold was so valuable that it transformed the small island into a veritable empire of wealth. While the rest of the world was dreaming of prosperity, Nauru was living an economic fairy tale. To give you an idea, in 1975, the per capita income of Nauruans reached an astronomical $176,000. This was more than 3 times the per capita income of the United States at the same time. With so much money flowing in, the Nauruans indulged in luxury and ostentation. Cadillacs, Jeeps, and Land Rovers cruised the island's few roads as if they were parading in Beverly Hills. And it didn't stop there. The government paid for everything: health, education, housing, and nobody paid taxes. The island became a feast of abundance, and residents invested abroad, buying property and traveling the world as if tomorrow would never come. But, as in any fairy tale, the magic was short-lived. Uncontrolled exploitation depleted the phosphate resources, and suddenly what was a sea of money became a desert of debt. What remains of this golden age? Abandoned cars, decaying buildings, and a population that has seen its paradise turn into a nightmare. Number 9. The effects of mining on the island. As they say, all good things are short-lived, and on Nauru this couldn't be more true. Phosphate, which brought so much wealth to the small island, was also responsible for its destruction. Unbridled exploitation has left the interior of Nauru practically barren, like a lunar soil full of craters. The environmental impact was so severe that, as early as the 1960s, experts began to sound the alarm. Nauru was becoming uninhabitable. The fertile land full of life had been replaced by a devastated desert, the direct result of incessant mining. The situation was so worrying that in 1962, the Australian Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, publicly acknowledged Australia's responsibility to guarantee a dignified future for the Nauruans, considering the immense profit they made from the island's phosphate. At the time, they even considered relocating the entire population to an island near Queensland, Australia, or even migrating to countries like New Zealand and the United Kingdom. The devastation was such that scientists believed that, by the mid-1990s, Nauru would become completely uninhabitable. Recovering the land would be a huge and extremely expensive challenge. But despite all the proposals, the Nauruans decided to resist. Abandoning their homeland was not an option. Even in the face of a bleak scenario and an uncertain future, they chose to stay and face the consequences of a wealth that, ironically, led them to ruin. Number 10. Transformation into one of the poorest countries in the world. And what seemed like a choice of resistance turned out to be an even more difficult battle. As we said earlier, over time, the phosphate reserves that sustained the island's economy began to disappear. In the 1980s, Nauru was plunged into a deep and relentless crisis. Without the resource that powered the country, the economy collapsed, leaving only a trail of environmental devastation and an increasingly bleak future. In a desperate attempt to save what was left, the authorities discovered a secondary phosphate deposit and resumed mining. But this new hope was a short-lived relief. In less than a decade, these reserves also came to an end, and Nauru once again found itself on the brink of the abyss, with a shattered economy and a wasteland that was almost beyond repair. It seemed that there was no way things could get any worse, but rock bottom held even darker surprises. Number 11. Open-air prison. With phosphate gone and the economy collapsing, Nauru was plunged into absolute chaos. Corruption and money laundering were rife, and climate change was destroying what was left of the fishing industry. The scenario was devastating. The once rich land was now a barren field, and unemployment reached almost 80% of the population. The crisis seemed like a bottomless pit. It was at this desperate moment that, in 2001, Australia came up with a grim proposal: pay for Nauru to become a detention center for refugees trying to reach Australian territory. With no options and on the verge of bankruptcy, the Nauruan government accepted. Yes, to avoid total collapse, the island began importing asylum seekers. Thus was born the Nauru Regional Processing Center, a detention center run by the local government. Anyone arriving in Australia by boat seeking asylum would be sent directly to Nauru, where they would face inhumane conditions, overcrowding, constant abuse, and human rights violations. The situation was so serious that the International Criminal Court classified the practices as illegal, and countries around the world, along with the UN and human rights groups like Amnesty International, strongly condemned what was happening there. In 2015, in an attempt to control the criticism, the Nauruan government even banned Facebook temporarily, claiming to be protecting residents from pornography. But few believed this justification. The real intention seemed to be to stifle denunciations and hide what was going on behind the scenes of this detention center. Remember how we talked at the beginning about the difficulty of getting a visa to visit the island? That's the main reason. To keep everyone blind without knowing what's really going on there. To complete the gloomy scenario, Nauru only abolished the death penalty in 2016, showing how tensions and rigid policies are still part of everyday life on the island. The small nation has become a tragic example of the price one pays when all resources are exhausted and choices disappear. What was once a paradise of wealth is now remembered as an open-air prison, where hope seems to have been buried along with the phosphate mines. And so we come to the end of our journey through Nauru, this fascinating little spot lost in the middle of the Pacific. We hope you've enjoyed discovering more about the mysteries, peculiarities, and surprising stories of this island. If you, like us, are passionate about exploring unique places and different cultures, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to follow our next adventures. There's much more of the Bello Mundo to explore together. For those of you who have watched this far, thank you very much and see you next time.